The goat looked wrong up there. Not wrong in the wildlife is surprising way. Wrong in the way a smoke alarm feels wrong when you're sure you didn't burn anything. It stood on the dam's crest, where concrete met wind and the air tasted faintly metallic, the way it always does around big water and machinery. Small body, tough hooves, horns that made it look permanently unimpressed. It wasn't lost either. No frantic scanning, no jittery steps, no desperate search for a way down. It had chosen the place. That was what made people slow their cars. The access road along the reservoir had its usual traffic: maintenance pickups, delivery vans heading to farms, the occasional tourist who treated a dam like a scenic overlook. A few rolled past, saw the goat, smiled, snapped a photo through the window, and kept going with the harmless satisfaction of seeing something wild before lunch. The goat didn't perform for any of them. It didn't pose. It didn't wander. It didn't beg for salt the way goats sometimes do when they've learned humans are basically walking snack machines. Instead, it kept returning to one narrow section of concrete near a service walkway, an ordinary seam most eyes would slide right past. It paced a short line there, stopped, stared at the spillway, and then, almost like a punctuation mark, scraped the concrete once with a front hoof, a clean, sharp scrape. Then, stillness. The first person to get irritated was a maintenance lead named Perez, the kind of worker who carried routine on his shoulders like a tool belt. He didn't hate animals. He hated disruptions. Disruptions meant paperwork, hazard meetings, phone calls, and signs that someone would ignore anyway. He tried the obvious: arms waving, loud claps, a confident approach, because humans love pretending confidence is a universal language. The goat blinked. That was all. Perez tossed a pebble near it, not to hit it, just to startle it into leaving. The pebble skittered, bounced, and died on the concrete. The goat stepped back 2 slow paces, watched the pebble settle like it was considering the philosophy of rocks, then walked forward again and placed its hooves in almost the exact same footprint as before. Same seam, same angle, same stubborn claim on that one unremarkable strip of dam. Perez felt the irritation curdle into something he didn't like naming, because animals usually react messily, even bold ones. This one was tidy, deliberate. By evening, wind slid harder over the crest. The reservoir darkened into a heavy sheet, reflecting the dam lights in broken lines. The valley below glowed with scattered human life: porch lamps, passing headlights, the faint pulsing sign of a gas station on the highway. The goat stayed through the night. Security cameras caught it the way cameras catch everything: flat, grainy, indifferent. A small shape barely moving, shifting weight now and then, tracing the same short path near the seam, returning again as if pulled by an invisible thread. Morning arrived crisp. The goat was still there. Now it wasn't a novelty. It was a situation. A ranger was called, mostly because that's what systems do when they don't know what else to do. Move the weird thing away. Restore the normal picture. Luke Harlan showed up before noon. Local ranger, practical reputation, quiet manner that made people speak softer without realizing it. He parked near the service gate, took in the dam first, then the reservoir, then the valley below. He didn't rush his eyes. He let them settle, like someone reading a room before stepping into it. The dam itself had a constant soundtrack. Water pressure humming behind concrete, distant machinery, wind worrying metal railings. Luke had walked this crest for years, and that mattered. Familiar structures have familiar voices. You notice when the voice changes. Today, the vibration under his boots felt slightly unfamiliar. Subtle, not alarming, but irregular, in a way his body registered before his mind decided what to call it. He approached the goat carefully, not because it might attack, but because it might do something stupid near the spillway gates if spooked. Up close, the animal looked healthy. No limp, no foam, no ragged breathing. Its eyes were bright, alert, more like a guard dog's eyes than a scavenger's. Luke expected it to bolt when he got close. It didn't. It looked at him, then turned its head back toward the seam like it was recentering its attention, and dragged its hoof once along the concrete. A short, precise sound, as if tapping the same spot on a wall where you swear you heard something behind it. Luke crouched and placed his palm flat near the seam. Cool surface. Cooler than the surrounding concrete should have been under a late morning sun. Beneath that coolness, a faint tremor. Tiny. Almost easy to imagine. Except it repeated when his hand moved closer to the seam and faded when he moved away. He tried again, shifting his hand like a blind person reading Braille. Near the seam, vibration. A few inches off, nothing. Luke straightened and waved Perez over. Perez came with his "this is dumb" face, saw Luke's expression, and adjusted to, okay, maybe not dumb. He bent down, squinted at the seam, and found what looked like a pencil mark. A hairline crack, so thin it would have been invisible to anyone not searching for it. "Old damn," Perez muttered. Temperature cycles. Normal wear. Luke didn't argue. He just watched the goat. The goat scraped again, and Perez, despite himself, traced the crack with a fingertip. His nail caught, barely, just enough to change his face. People hide fear in a lot of expressions. This one was the look of a man who suddenly wished he'd never touched the thing. They called an engineer. Dana Keel arrived 2 hours later from the district office, hard hat on the passenger seat, mud on the wheel wells, and the kind of calm you build after watching minor issues turn into expensive disasters. She didn't joke about the goat. She didn't take selfies. She didn't talk about how cute it was. Her eyes went straight to the seam. She walked the crest, measured, marked, checked records on a tablet, then used a small hammer to listen to the concrete. Most of it answered in the same solid tone. Near the seam, the tone softened by a shade, just enough to be meaningful if you knew what you were listening for. Dana's posture tightened. No drama, no shouting, just a quiet shift that said, "This is no longer a wildlife problem." Barriers went up. Foot traffic was rerouted. Tourists complained. A few filmed from behind the rail like the world had provided them entertainment again. Behind the barrier, the goat remained. It watched the workers in hard hats, the way it watched the water. Steady, focused, oddly patient. Dana asked for historical drawings and repair logs. Dams have memory, not in a mystical way, but in a structural way. Old fixes, old shortcuts, old storms that left microscopic scars. This one had been built in the late 1960s, at the end of a long drought cycle, when the valley had demanded water security and the politicians had demanded speed. Dana found what she didn't like. The seam wasn't just a seam, it was a cold joint. Two different pores meeting under different conditions, a line that could remain harmless for decades, until it didn't. She also found records of a major spring melt years later, followed by a repair. reinforcement plate, drainage modifications, notes about seepage being controlled and monitored. Controlled and monitored are comforting words. They can also be the soft pillow people put over problems so they can sleep. That afternoon, weather shifted. The sky took on a dull, washed metal color. Wind began dragging long ripples across the reservoir. Forecasts that had promised a chance of rain upgraded themselves into something heavier, urgent, almost embarrassed by how wrong they'd been. The storm arrived in layers. First, light tapping on helmets and jackets, then sheets of rain, then a loud, continuous roar that turned the dam's soundtrack into something deeper, more forceful. Up in the mountains, creek beds filled and water began pushing into the reservoir. Not a cinematic surge, steady, relentless, the kind of rise that looks calm until you've watched enough of them to know calm can be a disguise. The crew worked through it. They opened inspection panels, they checked drainage outlets, they followed the hairline crack to where it slipped under a metal plate near the service walkway. When they unbolted the plate and lifted it, the hidden crack behind it was wider than anyone wanted. Still not split in half. Wide. Not the movie version of catastrophe, but real, alive, active. Inside the joint, water had been seeping for a long time, patient as a thief. It had carried grit, left mineral traces, and weakened the seam in a way that stayed invisible until the storm provided the pressure it needed. Worse, a drainage outlet below that section was partially clogged, silt, leaves, debris packed in the wrong place like a cork. Drainage is the dam's quiet safety valve. When it chokes, pressure starts finding its own routes. Water, unlike people, doesn't care about rules. Dana's face didn't change much. Engineers don't show panic. They show decisions. Flow diversion, outlet clearing, sealant injection, temporary reinforcement, monitoring sensors installed fast enough to feel like a race. A lot of it looked boring from the outside. Wet gloves, headlamps, careful hands moving tools. That's how real disaster prevention looks. Quiet. Unphotogenic. No speeches. Inside the dam, though, it was a different world. The interior galleries were narrow corridors of concrete, metal doors, echoing footsteps, and a smell like damp dust. Two technicians moved through them with flashlights and radios, checking seepage collectors and joints where water was allowed to appear in tiny, controlled amounts. Halfway down, one of them stopped. He didn't see anything at first. He heard it. A wet hiss, faint but persistent, the sound of water forcing itself through a place it shouldn't be. He followed it to a service panel, unlatched it, and aimed his light inside. A thin stream was coming through a joint. Not a drip, not a trickle. A steady, narrow push, water in a hurry, trying to become something bigger. The report hit Dana's radio, and for the first time all day, her calm got sharper. She ordered the Crest Road shut down beyond the barrier. She notified the valley's emergency coordinator. She requested an inspection team from the next county and a state investigator on standby. Words you do not use unless you are preparing for the possibility you don't want to say out loud. The goat stayed in place, soaked now, fur darkened, still refusing to leave. Luke, watching it, felt an uncomfortable thought take shape. This animal wasn't simply being stubborn. It looked like it was waiting for a specific moment. Down in the valley, life continued, until it didn't. Sirens are strange in a quiet place. They don't sound like action. They sound like something is breaking in the world's routine. People looked out windows. Dogs barked. A few thought it was a drill. Then phones buzzed. Notifications rolled in. Volunteers knocked on doors in the floodplain corridor. Precautionary evacuation. Lowest river corridor only. Move to higher ground. People don't immediately panic in situations like that. First, they get confused. Then they get angry. Then they move. Because even the most stubborn person recognizes a certain tone in official alerts. Marin Soto, admin at the volunteer fire station, didn't waste time on emotion. She had grown up near a levee breach in another county years ago and had learned the lesson the hard way. When water decides to travel, it doesn't ask permission. She activated routes, set crews at intersections that jammed easily, checked the clinic's backup power, and made sure the school bus lot was available in case transport was needed. Small, practical moves that become the difference between orderly evacuation and chaos. Back on the dam, the reservoir crept higher. Dana opened the spillway gates wider to release water in controlled pulses. Downstream channels handled it as designed. The river swelled, muddy and fast, but stayed within the managed corridor. The dam, under that load, felt different. Not like a living thing, but like a structure doing difficult work. Inside, the leak hissed. Sensors showed pressure rising at the seam faster than expected. Moisture patterns shifted. The vibration signature changed, not enough to terrify a random person, but enough to turn Dana's stomach into a tight knot. She sent a team back into the galleries. This time, they didn't just find seepage. They found evidence of something that didn't fit. A panel screw that didn't match the others. A scrape on metal as if something had been pried. A wedge of plastic lodged where it shouldn't exist, blocking part of a drainage path. A deliberate obstruction. Dana stared at it under the flashlight beam and felt a coldness that had nothing to do with the storm. Because aging concrete was one problem, pressure was another. But human interference, that changes the story. It turns maintenance into investigation, and it turns risk into anger. She reported it up the chain. Security was notified. State investigators were called formally now, not politely. Access logs were pulled, camera feeds reviewed, contractor lists opened like old wounds. The storm didn't care about any of that. Near dawn, runoff surged again from a second wave upstream. Dana adjusted spillway flow to relieve pressure. The valley's evacuated corridor waited on higher ground, watching the river from a safe distance, with the kind of silence people wear when they can't decide whether they're grateful or terrified. A helicopter arrived later with thermal imaging equipment, normally used for wildfire mapping, tonight used to map water movement behind concrete. From above, the dam looked like a dark curve with faint bright streaks where heat signatures suggested moisture traveling through hidden paths. Dana watched the feed and felt her throat go dry. The seam was active. The seam was speaking. She made the call she hated making. Maintain evacuation until reservoir levels dropped. Prepare for a longer event. Keep crews rotating. No shortcuts. No fatigue mistakes. Luke stayed on the crest, soaked, stiff, watching the goat. The animal had shifted a little, as if giving the crews space, standing now nearer the barrier and facing the interior access door. Its posture had tightened, ears forward, body still, attention locked. The idea that a goat could sense anything sounded ridiculous to say out loud, and yet Luke had his palm memory. that strange vibration under his skin. He couldn't unfeel it. By mid-morning, the storm weakened. Rain softened to drizzle, clouds frayed into lighter patches, and the reservoir's rise slowed until it finally stopped. The spillway continued releasing, but with less urgency. Inside the dam, the hiss quieted into something more controlled. Dana stepped back and listened again to the structure. Not with poetry, with training. The tone near the seam was improved, not perfect, not safe forever, but stable enough to survive the current load. Hours later, as levels dropped below a safer threshold, evacuation orders relaxed. People returned to their homes with the strange feeling of having lived through something they barely understood. Official statements came out: early detection, timely response, precautionary evacuation. All correct, all careful. Then someone posted a photograph online. A mountain goat on the dam in heavy rain, hard-hatted crews behind a barrier, a structure looming in mist. A small animal standing where it didn't belong, as if it had insisted on being heard. The photo spread across the valley faster than any official update. It was absurd in a way people found comforting. Fear is heavy. Absurdity lets you carry it without collapsing. A cafe ran a themed drink for a week. A teacher printed the image for a class. Someone joked about giving the goat a badge. Luke didn't laugh much, but even he felt the odd relief of having a symbol that wasn't purely terrifying. Dana, however, didn't sleep. That night, in the district office, she pored over access logs, badge swipes, maintenance schedules, contractor records. She zoomed into photographs of the obstruction, studied the cut edges, the thickness, the type of plastic. It wasn't random trash. It looked like industrial material cut to fit. She cross-referenced suppliers. Only one local distributor stocked that exact thickness in bulk. The distributor's major customer in the region, unsurprisingly, was a maintenance contractor who had worked on dam systems. Dana didn't announce sabotage. Engineers hate dramatic words. Dramatic words invite lawsuits and politics. Instead, she requested clarification, purchase records, work orders, entry authorization lists, camera footage from the service gate. Luke helped quietly because the valley had taught him what hidden negligence looks like. He reviewed the gate footage, rain-speckled lens, poor angle, a truck arriving at night, a man stepping out, hat low, shoulders hunched, using a badge, leaving again. Could be normal, could be a crew member, could be a mistake. Except the truck's markings didn't match dam authority vehicles, and the plate matched a subcontractor tied to the contractor Dana had flagged. Now, the story gained teeth. State investigators arrived with paperwork and slow confidence, the kind that makes people nervous even when they've done nothing wrong. Offices were searched, storage units opened, computers imaged. They didn't find a Hollywood villain kit. They found something worse, because it was ordinary. Evidence of a culture of shortcuts. Cheaper materials substituted. Drainage components not installed as specified. Inspection reports copied and reused because it looked fine last time. They found shim stock and wedges cut to size. They found photos of interior panels labeled with dates. Planning without the courage to call itself planning. Dana pushed for a full retrofit. Not a patch it and hope retrofit. A real one. Expanded drainage, reinforced joints, upgraded monitoring arrays, structural review of the entire cold joint system. Budgets resisted. Politicians hesitated. People hate spending money on disasters that didn't happen. Dana didn't sell fear. She sold probability. She put graphs on a screen. She used the storm data, the sensor anomalies, the interior seepage evidence, and the obstruction findings. She spoke with the cold clarity of someone who refuses to gamble with a valley's life. Approval came. Slow, but final. The valley complained about construction noise, traffic, and inconvenience, because that's what valleys do when they're trying to feel normal again. Then, the work became part of the landscape. Cranes on the crest, mixers on the access road, crews moving like ants around a giant sleeping animal of concrete. Luke visited often, sometimes officially, sometimes because he couldn't stop thinking about it. He'd been involved in other incidents years earlier. Another district, another structure, a failure chain that began with people ignoring tiny warnings. Nobody said, "Your fault," but guilt doesn't require permission. This dam hadn't failed, but the sensation of almost failure sat in him like an unfinished sentence. Over the months, the goat appeared again. Not constantly, not like a mascot, but in a pattern that made Luke's skin prickle. It showed up on the crest when storms brewed. It lingered near the seam during heavy winds. It vanished when conditions calmed. No fanfare, no dramatic moments. Just a quiet, stubborn presence that seemed to orbit the seam the way a compass needle orbits north. Dana never officially wrote, "The goat predicted anomalies." She wasn't going to give politicians an excuse to roll their eyes. Still, she privately asked her team to note correlations between wildlife reports and sensor spikes. If the world hands you extra data, you take it, even if it arrives wearing horns. Then came the second storm. Not as violent as the first, but enough to raise reservoir levels and retest every nerve in the system. The retrofit wasn't finished yet. Temporary reinforcements were in place. Sensors watched the seam like hawks. Luke drove up before dawn. He didn't tell himself he was afraid. He told himself he was being responsible. The difference matters, even if it's a lie. When he reached the crest, he saw the goat again, standing where it had no business standing. Not on the exact same patch, because living things rarely repeat with perfect geometry, but near enough to make the message feel personal. Luke walked slowly, rain beginning as a thin mist. The goat watched him, then looked back to the seam as if Luke were late. Dana arrived shortly after, eyes tired from months of paperwork and concrete dust. She saw the goat and didn't smile. She went straight to the nearest sensor panel. Readings were normal. The goat scraped once, sharply, and Dana's panel chirped a moment later, just a small pressure spike localized at the seam. Tiny, brief, but new. Dana didn't argue with coincidence. She treated it as signal until proven otherwise. Interior check, crest closure, spillway adjustment early, not late. Notify valley coordinator. This time, nobody hesitated. Marin Soto's crew moved with faster discipline because once you've done an evacuation for real, you don't pretend it's impossible again. The clinic confirmed backup power. Buses stood ready. Road crews set cones and directed traffic like it was a grim rehearsal they'd already survived. Inside the dam, technicians found active moisture along the joint again. Not a stream, not a crisis, a warning. Dana pulled seismic data and found what she suspected, a microquake overnight, small enough that most people slept through it, close enough to stress the seam. Earth movement doesn't care about schedules either. Now the risk picture turned into a web, not a line. Aging structure, cold joint, past shortcuts, tampering, storm pressure, ground movement. Any one of those could be manageable. Together, they could become the kind of story nobody wants to be inside. The investigation, meanwhile, kept tightening. Warrants, searches, interviews, quiet panic in contractor offices, more records showing corners cut and signatures forged. Nothing cinematic, nothing explosive, just the dull horror of realizing the valley's safety had been treated like an accounting trick. Dana's retrofit plan expanded. More reinforcement, more drainage, more monitoring. A long project, expensive, disruptive, deeply unsexy. It also worked. Over time, sensor anomalies became less frequent. Pressure spikes quieted. Seepage patterns normalized. The seam stopped speaking in that uneasy way. The valley slowly returned to forgetting the dam again, which is the healthiest relationship you can have with a wall that holds back a lake. Luke never fully forgot. One afternoon, near the end of summer, he saw the goat not on the crest, but above it, on the rocky slope where tourists didn't go. It stood with a younger goat, smaller, jumpier, full of that clumsy confidence youth carries. The older animal looked down toward the dam for a long moment, then turned away like it had finished checking something. Luke watched through binoculars and felt a weird mixture of gratitude and irritation. Gratitude because the animal had forced attention, irritation because the story sounded insane if you said it plainly. A year later, the retrofit was completed. New drainage systems, reinforced joints, monitoring arrays sensitive enough to catch changes smaller than a fingertip. Public presentations with charts and confident assurances. The dam authority thanked crews and volunteers and insisted everything was under control now permanently, as if permanence is a promise humans have the right to make. Officially, there were no speeches about goats. Unofficially, the valley remembered. A cafe kept the photo framed. A local artist painted a mural. A small goat silhouette against a storm-dark dam, the valley below glowing with warm lights. Kids at school called it the Sentinel and argued about whether it deserved a medal. Marin Soto kept a sticker in her desk drawer, not because she believed in symbols, but because reminders are a kind of insurance. Luke's reminder was simpler. He remembered the vibration under his palm, the hiss inside concrete, the line of cars leaving the floodplain under low clouds, the way people looked when they came back and couldn't decide whether to laugh or cry. Years passed. On a clear morning, Luke returned to the dam alone. The crest was quiet, the reservoir calm, the spillway sleeping. Concrete looked clean, almost new in places, with the subtle freshness of repaired strength. He walked to the seam. No crack, no damp stain, no cool strip that didn't match the sun. He still placed his palm on the surface because memory makes rituals out of ordinary actions. Nothing, just solid, stable stone. For a moment, he allowed himself to believe in ordinary safety again. Then he heard a small scrape behind him. Luke turned. A mountain goat stood on the crest, 10 yards away, watching him with bright eyes and a face that looked permanently unimpressed. It wasn't soaked, it wasn't storm-battered, it looked like it had simply wandered by, bored, curious, unwilling to admit curiosity. It didn't approach, it didn't flee. It glanced at the seam, then looked out over the valley as if checking what mattered, then looked back at Luke. Luke exhaled a quiet laugh before he could stop it. The goat held its ground for a few seconds longer, like a final inspection no one asked for, then turned and walked away along the crest with light, effortless steps, disappearing down the rocky slope toward the cliffs. Luke watched until it was gone. He didn't tell anyone he'd seen it, not because he wanted the story to be his, because he knew how it would sound to someone who hadn't felt that vibration under their skin. Instead, he filed one last report, plain and short. Wildlife observed on crest. No hazard detected. Monitoring normal. Then he shut the office light and drove home through a valley that was again allowed to be ordinary. Roads stayed roads. Homes stayed homes. Fields stayed green. Kids ran along sidewalks without knowing what a seam in concrete could mean. Maybe that was the best ending. Not dramatic. Not poetic. Just a quiet day that existed because someone, once, listened to a warning that arrived wearing horns.